Hi, welcome to our third discussion about getting to grips with Business Central in conjunction with JavaScript. So when we started this journey, we had a little discussion about how the two worlds, the very diverse worlds of Business Central and JavaScript, talk to each other. We have to bear in mind that they are very different worlds. So Business Central lives in its own little bubble and JavaScript lives in its own little bubble. And we create a thing in the middle called a control add-in, which will link the two together. So in Business Central, we have our tables, pages, code units, etc. On the JavaScript side, we have some combination of HTML, style sheets, and JavaScript code. And then in the middle, we create a thing called a control add-in, which provides a conduit or a channel of communication between these two very diverse worlds. How does that work in practice? So let's have a look in a little bit more detail at the plumbing. Starting with our Business Central page, you'll be familiar with using controls in the form of fields, where you give it the keyword field, you give it a name, which is the name by which the control is known, and you refer it to something else. So that is normally a variable or a field name in the underlying table. In this similar way, we create a thing called a user control. It starts with the keyword user control. We give it a name, which we choose, and then we refer it to a Business Central object called a control add-in, which I will come back to in a moment. Similarly to a field control, our user control can have triggers defined. So typically on a field, we may have an onValidate trigger. Our user control can also have triggers, and I'll come back to how we define those a little later. Moving across to JavaScript. So JavaScript kind of functions in a similar way. Its equivalent to a user control is a thing called an element. So an element is something that exists on the page. It would be a button, could be a heading, could be a text box, could be anything that is visible on a web page. The ones that we would typically be using interactively would be things like buttons or text boxes. Now, within our JavaScript environment, when we want to act on something that a user does, or we want our element to respond to something that the user does, we define that via an event. And there are many pre-built events, which, depending on what the element is, which will allow the user to interact with our JavaScript page. And for example, if it's a button, it will have an event such as on click or on enter or on leave. So when the user does this, it will trigger an event, and in that event we can define code, some action that we want the page to take in response to the user's initiation. So far, so good. Our problem now, though, is that when we plug a JavaScript element onto our Business Central page, although it is effectively almost like squatting on the Business Central page, it really doesn't know that that page exists. It has no way of, in fact, interacting with it. The user can still hover over it. I can cause it to, for example, change color or to pop up a message within JavaScript, but I can't get it to do anything within the Business Central environment. And after all, what's the value of that? So let's move on to our next step. Right, this will give us a broader picture or better picture of how this all hangs together and how, as I say, as the plumbing functions. So starting on the Business Central page again, we define this thing called a user control. The object that it refers to is called a control add-in. So within an AL file, we will define the object control add-in, and within that we give it a certain definitions. The first thing that we need to do is we need to give it some basic information about the physical properties. Now, it's important to note that this, in fact, does not create anything just yet from JavaScript. What this does is it creates effectively a placeholder, and the placeholder will then be used to insert JavaScript elements. You can think of it a little bit as a guest room. So within our Business Central page, we are creating a place where we can host our JavaScript elements, and we will give it, as I say, physical parameters such as height and width, and we will tell it where to go and look to find our JavaScript code and our style sheets. Within JavaScript, we will start with how do we trigger something from JavaScript to Business Central. And as I mentioned, we do this via the event. The event will then cause something to run through the control add-in. When we put this on to our page, it's almost like a squatter. So it will be living inside the control add-in, but still it will not be aware of the Business Central page. So even though I may be able to click or move or change color, do things to that element within JavaScript, I'm still not acting on it in Business Central. So in order to provide a path of communication from JavaScript to Business Central, we will create an event within our control add-in. It is simply a declaration. Starts with the keyword event, and it will have a name, and it will have one or more, well, I suppose it could have null, but it will have a set of parameters that we need to pass to Business Central. So if we need to send information, we will do that through the parameters of our event. And over here, we will have a command which will tell this JavaScript element to talk to this declaration, which is sitting over here. And this is nothing more than a conduit. So this will then talk to the trigger, which is defined on this page. This trigger and this event will have, number one, the same name, and number two, the same set of parameters. So the same name, the trigger name, and the event declaration must be the same. And the parameters that are accepted by the trigger must match here. They don't necessarily have to have the same names, but they do need to have the same data types, and they need to have the same number of parameters. So if I have one text string here, I need to have one text string there. If I have a text string and a number here, I need to send a text string and a number over here. That's great. So what I could do here, for example, is click. The click will tell this control add-in that I need to call a trigger in Business Central, and that will pass my parameters over here. The trigger will happen. The trigger will be triggered, so to speak. And whatever code I have defined within that trigger using normal Business Central language will happen. So I could be calling a table, I could be opening a page, or anything that is a valid operation within Business Central. So that's fantastic. Sometimes I need to send something back to JavaScript. So I need to change something that is happening over here. And the way I do that is through a normal procedure call. So from here on within my Business Central page, it could be something within one of the triggers, or it could in fact just be a function within my Business Central page, a normal procedure definition. I will make a call to my control add-in, and on my control add-in, I will have a procedure declaration. So again, it's just a declaration. There is no code stored here except for the declarations. There will be a procedure declaration that has a name, starting with the keyword procedure. So it could be procedure, my function, and then followed by, in brackets, a set of parameters. That definition has to then have the same as I have got here, an equivalent name. This definition here must match exactly the function defined in JavaScript. So in JavaScript, we use the keyword function as opposed to here where we start with procedure. Other than that, they will be identical. So they will have the same name and they will have the same parameter list. So if I have two parameters here, I need to have two parameters here. Always bearing in mind, of course, in JavaScript doesn't really know about a thing called a data type. You don't declare things with a specific data type. Nevertheless, the two parameters must match two parameters there. Or if I have three parameters here, I need three parameters here. And that will then allow Business Central to send stuff back this way. These things now, depending on how clever I get with my coding, they will interact. I've now created a conduit. So this is no longer just a squatter on my Business Central page. It is a thing that is driving functionality in Business Central. And of course, it will also allow me to trigger things back into JavaScript to do things that I could not do from Business Central. And that could also be something like a call to another application, a call to a web page, a call to an API, something like that. So this gives me a much richer environment, allows the two to work together, and they coexist. Now, the only things to remember is that the relationship event to event declaration to trigger 1-to-1, event declaration trigger 1-to-1, and the parameters need to match up. The syntax in the three environments, the control add-in, the BC page, and the JavaScript, may be slightly different, but in ways that we'll come to when we start unpacking the code. They do need to match. If they don't match, you may get an error that you can deal with. Good chance that you will get no message. It simply won't work. Right, so let's get into the nitty-gritty of the code. I've opened up now all of the elements that we are going to be working with. So I have my Business Central page over here, the control add-in over there, two JavaScript scripts, and my style sheet, which will be used to do my initial formatting. Now, I want to take this step by step, so I'm not going to try and do everything all at once. So sorry, you are going to have to watch me do a little bit of basic coding. Hope that won't be too boring for you. Let's start with a page. So we've got our page, we've created our user control. I've given it a name. This thing in white is my name, and the thing in green is the name of the control add-in. So this is just a name. I could have called it XYZ, anything I like. I'm calling it guest room because I do want us to start thinking about this as creating a guest space within our Business Central page to host our JavaScript elements. Right, so what I need to do now is I have defined my guest room as a control add-in. So control add-in guest room, that is going to be referred to down here. I have a few physical parameters. So this is the floor space of my guest room. It's the amount of space I'm going to make available to my JavaScript elements to occupy. Then I'm telling it where to find those JavaScript elements. First is my startup script, which will execute once, my script, which contains my main business logic, and lastly, my style sheet, which will provide the information about how to format my JavaScript elements when I start the page. And let's begin with that. So that I can visualize and see my guest room on the page, I'm using this here. So this is a keyword in the style sheet. I don't need to tell it what that is. The HTML page will know how to interpret that. It means the body, the content of something, and I'm giving it a background color of kind of like a wishy-washy yellow color. The button I'm going to come back to because I'm not positioning that on the page just yet. So when I load this page, if I compile it right now, it's going to open my Business Central page, and it's going to put onto my Business Central page this sort of yellowy, browny colored block. Let's see what that looks like. For the moment, I am leaving my JavaScript files with basically nothing in them. They're not going to do anything at this moment. So if I now Control F5, select my server, and there it is. So this is my web page and my logo, which we created in the previous lessons. This is my placeholder over here. It does nothing. I can't click on it. I can't interact with it in any way. It is simply a space on the page. Right, what can we do with that? Not really very much. Let's go back a step. Let's talk about these two files. How do they interact and when do they execute? Now, a little, for me anyway, a little counterintuitively, the startup script actually runs after that. So when we load the page, this line here, which I'm highlighting, the script will execute first. So whatever is in this definition, basic button JS, is going to run first. And I'm going to uncomment these alerts so that we can understand exactly how that happens. Save there, save there. And just to help us understand that a little better, this is kind of my interpretation. Might not be 100%, but I think it's more or less right. So the first thing that happens is it will open the Business Central page. It will create the user control, in other words, the yellow blocky. Then it will define the physical parameters. So these things here, so it tells me what size, etc., color, and so on that I want for my block. And it will, of course, declare the events, although nothing's going to talk to them at this point because there's no code. And it will first run whatever is in JS script. After it has run JS script, it will then run JS start script. And when I say run, it's going to execute whatever is outside of functions. So in this case, I've put an alert there and I've put an alert there. So in my start script, I'm saying this is line 1 of start script, and this is line 1 over here of this file called basic button. So I'm now going to compile this again, and we should get some messages popping up. Okay, there's the first one. This message is coming from basicbutton.js, which is defined as my main script. I have not gone yet to my start script. Right, I will now click OK. This is coming from the start script over there, and say OK, and there's my page. So it has loaded all the other elements, and it has created my guest room over there. So I do find personally that that's a little confusing, but right, let's go back into the code. And now that we understand how the two scripts work and how they execute, I have commented out the alerts. We don't need them anymore. I have brought into my start script a new command, get started. So this is a function call. If you pay attention, you will see that it is calling the function down here. And this will be creating, effectively defining the button. How do we do that? Well, first of all, let's just talk about these global declarations over here. So I have declared a variable called BC data. It is initialized with the value get company name, which will be what it displays when the button appears on my page. I'm using a variable because I do want to be able to change the name, the content of that variable BC data later. Then I have declared a constant called control ID, and I'm setting it to the value basic button. That will be used to identify my button initially when I create it, and then later to be able to retrieve it so that I can act on it, so that I can do things with my button. Within the function get started, which will be called when this runs, I am declaring or creating the actual button, and I'm doing that by first of all defining two variables. I always like to show my work, remember. So the first one, I'm creating a variable called placeholder. It is effectively an object referring to the control add-in. So it's basically retrieving my control add-in, which is a thing sitting on the page. And I'm doing that by using the statement getElement by ID. That is obviously a JavaScript command. I'm asking it to give me the thing called control add-in, which is my yellow box, which is sitting on my page. I'm then going to create the button. It exists, but it is not yet inserted onto the page. So I'm creating this again using document, and I'm using the command create elements. And the parameter, although it is in quotes, it is actually referring to a fixed thing called a button. So I'm telling my document to create for me a thing called new button, which is of type button. And because I'm creating a button, it will go to my style sheet and it will create it using basically these two lines here, using the style definition for a button. Button is a keyword in the style sheet. So I'm giving it a color of dark red. The text will appear in white. I'm giving it the font size 16. I'm also making the font bold, so it's nice and clear. I'm telling it to occupy 100% of the width of my control add-in and 80% of the height. So what that's going to do is it's going to spread this button right across the available area of my page. And then lastly, I'm giving it a radius. So what that will do is it will give it nice, neat little round corners, and it will look like a button because that's what I want it to look like. Right, now that I have my button, I am assigning to my button the value which is in this thing control ID. In other words, its ID will now be basic button. And then lastly, we'll skip all of this. We'll come back to this a little later. Lastly, I'm placing it on the page. So I am now inserting into my placeholder, which remember is the control add-in. So this refers to this thing, my yellow block. And inside that, I am using the command append child to insert the new button. So I will now have a page created. The page will create the yellow block. And then within the yellow block, we're going to say get started, and we are going to effectively build this thing and insert it inside the yellow block as a button. And let's see how that looks when we compile it. Control F5. And there it is. How about that? So we can still see our little yellow block peeking out there. That's our guest room. And into our guest room, we have put our guest, which is the JavaScript button. Get company name. You can see it looks like a button because when I move over it, my mouse becomes the little finger, but it doesn't actually do anything. So I know you can't see this, but I'm actually clicking, clicking, clicking. Nothing is happening because I haven't told it what to do with it. But at least I now have my button and I have my description as I expect. It is 100% of the width. And the reason this little space is here is because I have told this to occupy only 80% of the guest room. I've done that deliberately just to illustrate how the two interact. I think what we do when we go back to the code is we will modify our code. Let me go back there. And what we are going to do is we are going to take down our height. In fact, let's leave that as that. What we will do is we'll make our height 100%. And yes, I think that could go a little bit smaller. We'll make it 80 and we'll make our maximum also 80. Make sure these are saved. Let's see if that looks a little neater. Yes, perfect. So now our style sheet for the body of the control add-in is hidden. I could, of course, simply have taken out the color, but I don't want to do that because I may want to reveal that later at a later stage. So that's the creation of the button. That's not really much use. We need to be able to do something with it, and we will come to that in our next section. Okay, it's time to start getting our mouse to do something useful. And to illustrate this, I'm going to first confine this to what happens only in JavaScript. So we've put our guest into our guest room. At this point, it still doesn't really know much about the fact that there is this whole other world outside its guest room. We are going to keep it that way for now. So what I'm going to do is on my get started function here, I've now created the button. What I'm going to do is I'm going to uncomment these two lines. And let's explain what these are. So if I go to the first one, what this is doing is it's creating an event to respond to the action of a user moving their mouse over the button. And then the second one, what happens when the user moves their mouse off the button. On mouse enter and on mouse leave are predefined. I didn't have to do that. They are predefined because I'm talking about a button. So a new button is a button. Because it is a button, it has events called on mouse enter and on mouse leave. When that event, let's take the first one, when that event happens, it's going to now call a function. I'm not going to go into all the intricacies of JavaScript and the way the coding works, just do it the way it is here. The keyword function, a pair of normal brackets, followed by the name of a function. That's a name that you can give it. I have called it mouse entered, so it kind of ties up. Open bracket, close bracket, and then close with curly brackets. So this whole thing here is enclosed in curly brackets. When the user moves their mouse over the button, it's going to now execute a function. And the function it's going to execute is this thing that's in curly brackets here. Mouse entered, and it's got open and close brackets. If I wanted to provide parameters, in this case I don't need to. When the user moves their mouse off the button, then it will execute this function, and it will run the function called mouse exited. So here is my mouse entered function. How does this work? Well, first of all, what I'm doing is I am using the command getElementID to retrieve my button. The name of the button is stored in this variable, this thing called control ID, which I defined up there. This thing contains the word basic button, that's the name, and I have applied it over here. So I have given this button the ID contained in control ID. I will use that same thing, control ID, to retrieve my button. So I'm back to having a thing called this button, which refers to the button on the page. And what I'm doing is I'm changing the content. So it will no longer contain the words get company name. It will now contain the words refresh from Business Central. And I'm also changing the color. So very simple. All I'm doing is as I move my mouse over it, I'm going to change the color, and I'm going to change the content of the button, the description of the button that is visible to the user. What happens when I say leave, when I move the mouse off that platform? Well, here is the code. I've added lots of comments to make it a little easier to understand. Function mouse exited. As up here, I'm going to use my control ID value to retrieve it using documents get element ID control ID. So now I can refer to this button. Then I'm saying if my variable BC data still contains the variable get company name, because remember I haven't changed the variable. When I did this, I simply acted directly on the button. I've stored this still in my variable is still set to get company name because I've done nothing to change it at this point. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the color back to its original color. Color start is defined up at the top here. There it is over there. It will change it to color start. And if BC data does not contain this, then something has happened in between to modify it. And I will change the color to color pressed. And lastly, I will set the text content back to BC data. So in other words, in my case, I have not yet done anything to change this button. As I move over it, it will change the color to dark green. As I move off it, it is going to change the color back to the original color and reset the content to BC data. And let's see what happens when we compile it. Control F5. Okay, so there is our button again. Now let's see what happens to my events. Here comes my mouse, here it comes. Boom. So while my mouse is hovering over that button, it has changed the wording to refresh from Business Central, and it has changed the color to green. As soon as I move my mouse outside the boundaries of the button, it reverts to the same color and the same text. Okay, it's time to bring this all to a close. What I ultimately am trying to do is to trigger Business Central functions and functionality from my JavaScript object, which is a button, a nice, pretty, colorful button. I have already managed within the JavaScript world, strictly within the JavaScript world over here, to illustrate how we can effect changes on the button by moving my mouse. So when I move my mouse into the button, it changes color. When I move my mouse out of the button, it changes back to its original color. But that's not all that helpful really in the real world. So what we are now going to do is we are going to start working on the click function. First thing I want to do, I'm going to uncomment that. So what I'm doing here on my button is I'm creating an on-click event. The on-click event belongs to the button. So because it is a button, it has a click function. And then I'm going to tell it when I click, when the user clicks, what do I want to happen? I'd start with the keyword function, round brackets, followed by enclosed in curly brackets, the functionality that must happen. In this case, I'm putting it all in another function called click button. I don't need to pass parameters, so I simply have two plain brackets. Now let's go and find what happens in click the button. So if I go down here, somewhere, there's my click the button. This is a function within JavaScript. Starting point, as always, retrieve the button, then declaring a constant called call text, and I'm giving it the value hello from JavaScript. This is just to illustrate. I'm going to pass that as a value into Business Central. As I click the button, I'm going to change the color. Hopefully that will be clear and evident when I do that. And then I'm going to use my extensibility method again. So Microsoft Dynamics Nav invoke extensibility method, and I have to give it a bunch of parameters, starting with the name of the event in my control add-in. So talking plumbing here. So this thing here, although it is enclosed in quotes to make it a string literal, that is the name of the function, this thing right here, that I'm going to use to call my event in the control add-in. So that goes to here. Note that it has to be spelled and capitalized in exactly the same way. It is case sensitive. If you misspell it or mistype it in any way, it is simply not going to work. So you need to make sure that what you have in those two quotes looks exactly like this. Then I'm going to pass it the parameters. So my event over here takes one parameter. I'm going to send one parameter here, all text. Note the square brackets. The square brackets denote an array. So all of the parameters that my event over here takes must be sent as an array. So if I need to send multiple parameters, so for example, if I wanted to send a number along with this, I could behind here do something like this. My number integer. So now I've got two parameters. What I would have done here is pass a number, something like that. So far, so good. I think that's pretty clear. So they have to be contained. Sorry, that's not quite right. Not there, but there. So that would pass 0 to my integer over there. So I am passing to button was clicked. Button was clicked. The variable or the constant call text, which will go in here as send text, and this will now look for a trigger on my Business Central page. So the trigger is defined over here. I have got it commented out, so let's just uncomment that again. Note that the names must be the same. So button was clicked there, button was clicked, button was clicked. They must be an exact match, and the parameters, whatever parameters I have here, must have a matching set over here and must have a matching set over there. And in this case, this link, not only must the number of parameters match, but the data type. So if I have a number defined here, I need to have a number defined here. Right, I'm now fully in control in Business Central, and my trigger is going to run. Let's see what it does. I am going to declare my company information table. Then just to show what I'm getting from JavaScript, I'm going to pop a message on the screen to display this thing get text. So where do you think that comes from? That is the value that is stored in there, which will say hello from JavaScript. Over here, that will contain hello from JavaScript. It will go to get text, and it will then magically appear on my screen. Then I'm going to get my company information table, and I'm going to call a function called show name and pass it the company information name. Obviously, you don't really need to do that. It's a single liner, but just for illustrative purposes, I have now got a procedure, nothing to do directly with my user control down here, called show name. It will contain the company name as text. And now I'm going to do a call via my control add-in back to JavaScript. So I start with the word current page. Within that, I'm going to get my control guest room, which is over here. Guest room in turn refers to my control add-in, this thing, and it is then going to look for a function or a procedure within the guest room control add-in called BC sends to JS, and it's going to send to that the company name that will arrive here as got from BC. It is text. This in turn will look in JavaScript for a matching function. So here we call it a procedure, and here we call it a function. The names must be identical, spelled the same case, everything must be the same. And whatever is contained here, which will of course be the company name will be passed to this parameter got from BC, and then we are back in control in JavaScript, and we will do the whatever is contained in this function, which in this case is very simplistic. I'm simply setting my variable BC data to this. Right, what happens next? Well, JavaScript has got control again, so it is now going to do this thing here, this final function. It's going to call the function reset button, which is over here. Let's just bring that up, and that is going to again get the button, set the style, so it's going to change the color, in this case to color pressed, which I think is set as gray, and it is going to change the text contained on the button. Now, because I am using a mouse enter and mouse leave events, it is also going to cause the mouse leave trigger to execute, or mouse exit to execute. So what will have happened is my user will have moved their mouse onto the button, which would have triggered a change in the color and a change in the text. Then they will have clicked, which will have caused all of this backwards and forwardsing of information from here to there, got the company name and sent it back via this to here. And eventually we would have ended up in the mouse exited function. So so the order of events would be mouse enter, mouse click, mouse exit. And this will then also, because my value of BC data will have changed, it will do this command here, and then it will set the value of text content back to BC data. And that is effectively the end of the discussion. Let's see how that works in practice. Control F5. Really need these messages anymore. We're happy with that. Okay. Mouse enter, mouse exit, mouse enter, mouse exit, mouse click. I hope you saw that change of color to orchid, lovely pretty pink. Hello from JavaScript. That is happening over here. That's my Business Central message happening. Sorry, not there. Over here, showing message get text. And it has also, you'll note, once it went back to JavaScript, it has changed this to gray, and it has changed that to the text light speed rules. Let's double check that. So I'm going to go over here to my company information. There it is, light speed rules. Let's change it. Light speed rules, okay. Click on it again, and you'll see that the name changes. So now I have got my company name nice and clearly displayed on the page. I don't have to rely on checking my URL or anything like that. I think that's pretty neat. In reality, of course, we will not do this with the click of a button. We will just display it. But the purpose of this has been to illustrate the movement of information from JavaScript to Business Central and back again. Let's just recap on our diagram. So we created a Business Central page. Onto that, we created a user control, which is linked to a control add-in. On the control add-in, we defined the control definition. The control definition created my guest room, a place where my JavaScript element could be inserted. My JavaScript element, I defined a couple of events, well, a few events, but two of them in particular, trigger events back into the control add-in, which in turn created a trigger to run in Business Central. I did some stuff in Business Central, and in this one as well, an event calls the event declaration, which in turn calls the trigger, and I sent some stuff back by a call to a procedure on my control add-in to a function in JavaScript, which then in turn did some JavaScript stuff. Okay, I think that's basically it. Go through this slowly and hopefully it will start to make sense. You're welcome to copy the code exactly as it is. Just pause the video whenever you want to copy the code and get creative and start building your own buttons and functions in JavaScript for Business Central. Cheers for now.